What's up, everybody, and welcome back. So I'm making this video strictly for educational purposes. So if you're somebody that's interested in the subject of Wootz, or you're just getting into making it, or you want to make it, then stick around. And another reason I'm making this video is because I'm constantly bombarded with questions about what material should I use, or I have XY materials and I'm going to use this. What do I do when I have an ingot? Things of that nature. And I have no problem answering questions and helping people out. So I'm hoping I can just direct them to this video, because some things can get kind of in depth and I don't really have time to just be writing paragraphs all day long. So I hope this helps. So there's a few things I want to go over: pattern visibility, forging stages, and carbide forming elements, and how all of those can affect your pattern and your pattern visibility. So one thing I've noticed with people that have asked me questions and that are interested in making Wootz, that they have an idea that it's similar to pattern welded steel, and that's not the case, not even close. They think that if they add some kind of nickel powder, or they put nickel in their charges, that it's somehow going to make their pattern better, and that's not the case at all. Actually, you're making something detrimental, or that can be detrimental. So I'm hoping that from this video you get an idea of the kind of materials that you should use. Now, I'm not going to tell you what you should use, or this is the perfect material. I'm not going to do that. You use what you can use what's available to you. But with the information I'm going to give you, it should be pretty clear what you want to use and what you probably want to stay away from. Now, I don't really want to make this video about the proper materials. What I'm trying to do here is tell you how certain materials with certain compounds in them can affect your pattern characteristics. Now, there's a few things that can affect your pattern visibility, and one of those is heat. So since I've been making Wootz, I've kind of been fighting my pattern visibility or vibrancy. And recently I took two ingots, we'll say ingot 1 and ingot 2, and I forged one kind of in a lazy manner, how I might have forged previously. And then ingot 2, I forged in a manner where I was very keen and precise and paid close attention to my temperatures, and I did very short forging passes, which meant I had more cycles overall. So, and what I noticed in that is that my pattern visibility increased dramatically. And I have blades to show, and I'll insert pictures of the blades, and I'll label them ingot 1 and ingot 2, and you can see the difference. Now, there's clearly a difference in pattern on the blades from ingot 1 and the blades from ingot 2. The pattern on the blades from ingot 2 were more bold and had more vibrancy. And another thing you can tell right away is when you start to grind your bevels in your blade, that pattern will just pop. You'll be able to see it even at 36 grit. So I came to the conclusion that I was forging too cold during the first stage of forging. Now, what is the first stage of forging? Well, that's to turn your ingot into a bar so you can make a blade out of it. And really, you're transforming the dendritic structure to a lamellar sheet structure. And that's, you're basically building the foundation of your pattern. So I'm going to briefly go over the first stage of forging and why it can be pretty difficult, especially without a thermocouple. So behind me is the iron-carbon phase diagram. Now, if you're not familiar with the iron-carbon phase diagram, you should be. So on the bottom of this graph is your carbon percentage. Up here is temperature. This is temperature in Fahrenheit, and this is temperature in Celsius, okay? Now, this is where things get a little tricky. So when you ask me, I have an ingot, how do I forge it? Well, that's going to depend on your carbon content, and that's going to depend on your alloying content. Now, our carbide forming elements, which changes a lot, and I'll get into that in just a second. That's why I really can't give you a specific route, because I don't know. That's a whole different steel than what I'm making. What I'm making, I'm perfecting. I'm trying to perfect my chemistry. So when you make things from XY, it's a whole different steel. It's going to take a whole different route. But for a very basic 1.6% steel that's low in carbide forming elements, which is what I'm making, I can show you what I do. So now, this is important because there's a lot of misinformation out there and pseudoscience. So when you have your ingot and it's come out of the roast and you're going to forge it, okay? This is the first stage of forging, which is above ACM forging, okay? What's ACM? Well, this is your ACM line. This is an important line when it comes to Wootz, okay? So for a 1.6% carbon steel, you want to be above this line when you forge. This is the area of pure austenite, okay? So your ingot is in a state of pure austenite. Now, as you can see, the window is pretty small until you start to get into what's known as the partial liquid, the mushy zone or slushy zone, whatever you want to call it. Okay, so for a 1.6% carbon ingot, you're going to want to forge between 2,250 degrees and 1,922 degrees. So you can see how that's a very small window, and how it's very easy to drop below this ACM line as you're forging your ingot out, because your ingot's still going to move below 1900 degrees. So that's why it's important to pay close attention to your temperature, and why I recommend having a thermocouple in your forge, even when you're on your second stage of forging. Now, I'm not really going to get into the second stage of forging. Now, there's another line that I forgot to mention, and it's the graphite line. Now, it's not shown in this diagram, but I've highlighted it in red as an example. And I believe it's about 50 degrees above ACM. And it's important to be above that line in the first stage of forging, because that's where graphite begins to fully dissolve. Now, another really important thing, and I've experimented with this myself, is carbide forming elements. Now, what are those? Well, those are your alloys. That's everything left of iron on the periodic table of elements. Now, this is where things get very complicated. Now, when people want to start with, XY material and it's high in alloying content, what you're doing is basically locking in a dendritic structure. And you're basically, you're never going to achieve a watered pattern, assuming that that's what you're trying to achieve. I would say that most of Wootz makers out there, they want to achieve that watered pattern. And if you don't know what the difference between a watered pattern is and a dendritic pattern, well, here's some pictures of my own steel. Here's some better examples of some watered patterns, which is what I'm trying to achieve. And it's important to note that the patterns on the blades from ingot 1 and 2 are lamellar. They're just not very watered. Although the last blade with the close-up pick is watered, but only in some areas, and that's the Wootz Bushcrafter. Now, I've made videos of all these blades and uploaded them to my channel. And recently, I've discovered a way to achieve a watered pattern in my steel, but I'm just not ready to share that yet. I need time to perfect it. But the more ingots that I make and forge in the blades, the better I'll get. Now, higher carbide forming elements, okay? Well, what is high and what is low? Well, a lot of it does kind of depend on your carbon content, but typically it's best to keep those low. So the more pure material you can use, the better. Now, why does having a high CFE content lock in that dendritic structure? Well, that's really not known, so I really can't speak on that. But what I can tell you is that they will raise your ACM line, and they will also prevent you from forging hot enough to dissolve those carbides before you enter the partial liquid zone. So they stay intact throughout the whole forging process, hence a more dendritic structure. And it's a clear observation, blades that are high in CFEs, they have a dendritic pattern. It's also worth mentioning that CFEs give a strong signal for carbide formation. And by doing that, that makes the pattern more bold and more vibrant. And that's because you have more CFE carbide in the interdendritic regions, or IDRs. Now the IDRs are your regions between all the iron crystals. And the iron crystals are just your dendrites. They form from solidification. Now, to illustrate why having a high content of strong carbide forming elements might be a bad idea, I'm going to insert a graph from Edgar Colin Bain's book, Functions of Alloying Elements in Steel. I highly recommend this book. Now, this graph is a representation of how titanium affects the austenite zone in steel, given a certain carbon percentage and percentage of titanium. Now, I think it's safe to say that strong carbide forming elements, such as vanadium and niobium, act very similar. You can also observe as the percentage of titanium goes up, the area of pure austenite starts to shrink. So a steel with 1.5% carbon and 0.30% titanium cannot be fully austenitic. And this is an example against using high amounts of strong carbide forming elements, except in trace amounts, assuming that the goal is a lamellar pattern. Now, there is another powerful element worth talking about, and that's phosphorus. But I'm not going to speak on phosphorus in this video because I've never forged an ingot with phosphorus. But this ingot right here contains 0.080% phosphorus. And I do plan on filming the process of this, and we'll see how phosphorus affects forging, heat treating characteristics, and pattern. So stay tuned on that. Well, that's all I'm going to cover in this video. I hope it was informative. I hope it helps give people a better understanding of what materials they might want to choose for whatever patterns they're trying to achieve. I do plan on making more videos on the melt, materials, second stage of forging, but as I learn more, I will share it. So anyways, thanks for watching and take care.